Hey, movie lovers and citizens of Earth, welcome to Extra Entertainment Extra. I'm Richard Crouse. Joining me in studio today, we have Don Coscarelli Jr. Does anyone call you Junior?
Well, that's actually a misnomer. I'm not a junior. My
Wikipedia.
father. I know. You can't read, can't believe what you read on the internet. Let's put it that way.
Don Coscarelli, he's an American film director, producer, and screenwriter, best known for horror films like the Phantasm series, The Beastmaster, and Bubba Ho-Tep. His latest film, John Dies at the End, a new street drug that sends its users across time and dimensions, has just one drawback. Some people return as no longer human. Can two college dropouts save humankind from the silent, otherworldly invasion? That's the question. And I'm not going to start there because I don't think there's an answer for this.
Well,
really.
The answer is probably not.
But this film played at the Toronto International Film Festival last September. It's on DVD right now. But you first found out about it in novel form, and I haven't read the story that sort of kicked off this whole thing. But I can't imagine what it looked like because the movie is insane, frankly.
Well, I'll take that as a compliment. Thank you, Richard.
You should.
It's an insane story, and I think that's what appealed to me because there was so much fantastic imagery in a novel, which is rare. So often, you're talking about themes and philosophies in novels when you're reading them, and you're not thinking about visual cinematic imagery. And some of these concepts that this great first-time author came up with were just great. And I read the log line and then got the book and realized that this would be my next movie.
Now, and what part of it specifically kind of pushed you to say, you know what, this is going to be the next one? Because there's so many kind of elements here that some I can see having through lines to the rest of your work. Some not so much. It's visual. There's a lot going on here. What was it that made you go, this is the one?
Well, on the surface, was it the talking dog or the monster made out of freezer meats or the sentient street drug called soy sauce that chooses you? I don't know. It was all of the above. Certainly, what I loved about the book was there were so many interesting philosophical explorations in the middle of this sort of wild horror comedy novel. And I wanted to explore some of those also. So that was it was just a wealth of riches and just I've made my living through the years. If now that you get a little older and you look back on some of my earlier pictures, I can see where it's, there are some themes. There's dimensional travel in some of my films and, kind of a outrageous humor. And just appealed to all of those.
It's funny though you say when you look back, because I guess when you're doing it, you don't see it as a through line. You don't see your trademarks developing.
Well, a career is only in retrospect, really. And it's. I used to get questions about this in the when early in my career, and I didn't know what people were necessarily talking about. But now I can actually see how people might categorize me in certain ways because we're all creatures of habit, and we follow our certain paths. Yeah.
Now, Paul Giamatti is one of the producers, as well as appearing in the film, and he said that this was a little tough to get made because of how different it is, how different the story is.
Absolutely true, and Paul was a gung-ho supporter of it, and I just have to thank him for that. I had gotten a chance to meet him because he was a fan of one of my previous films, Bubba Ho-Tep, and
which, if you haven't seen, you have to see Bubba Ho-Tep.
Well, as you say, if you're going to see one Elvis fighting a mummy movie this year, that's the it. But he loved that film, and we got to know one another. He's a really wonderful man, a great sense of humor, really decent. He's not like these typical Hollywood stars. Really well-read guy, and he sparked to the story. Also, I gave him a copy of my adaptation of the script, and we had been out trying to sell the film, a previous film, and we'd had a meeting at a studio, and I could tell that this executive really was dying to make a movie with Paul. Right. They just falling over it. Now, the other picture they didn't want to make. And so a week later, I emailed Paul. I said, Paul, would you mind submitting the John Dies to this gal? Because I think she wants to make a movie with you. And he says, okay, sure. And he wrote this glowing write-up of the script and emailed it off to the studio executive. And about 2 days later, he sent me her response, and it was just stunning, Richard, because she got the movie. She's going, well, how could you not want to make a movie that has where they're using a bratwurst as a cell phone, and the humor and the horror. And I'm like, going, oh my God! Well, here's a studio executive who's really examined my movie, read through every point of it, and then I get down to the final line, and says, which is exactly why our studio could never make this movie, because we'd have to take it into our development process to get it properly suited for a mall audience, and we'd have to remove everything in the story that you love.
We'd have to sand off all the rough edges.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So at that time, I knew it would have to be an independent film.
I'm speaking with Don Coscarelli, the director of John Dies at the End. It's on DVD and Blu-ray and however else people get movies today. And check it out. We're going to be talking about it for the next few minutes. I saw Paul Giamatti once at an airport, sitting in the gate waiting for his plane, and he was reading a really tattered science fiction novel. And people were he's sort of the everyman. People were just sort of leaving him alone. But I loved that he was sitting engrossed in this sci-fi novel. And there was, people were noticing him a little bit and stuff, but no one was bothering him. But he was so engrossed in it. And I guess maybe that's the same look that I saw that he had on his face when he read John Dies at the End for the first time.
He's an avid reader, and I know he reads all kinds of things, and has turned me on to some very interesting things I would never get to. But yeah, it was because it was out there and it was all there on the page, which was and since John Dies at the End takes you in down some of these paths and takes you into these philosophical realms also, it's unexpected, which. For me, coming out of the horror genre, you're always looking for something that's a little unexpected.
I think if you ever do the long talked about sequel to Bubba Ho-Tep, that Paul Giamatti would make a great Tom Parker, Colonel Tom Parker.
Well, yes, and it's a fantastic role and a fantastic character that's never really been depicted on film before. If the Elvis fans hate his guts. If you go on those all Elvis radios and people call in, God damn that man! He ruined Elvis's career. He let him do the drugs, and the amazing thing about it. Colonel Parker had visa issues. He may have not been a legal citizen of America, so Elvis was never allowed to tour outside the United States. He never went to never appeared in London. He never appeared in Tokyo. Can you imagine the biggest rock act or musical act ever? And he never strayed outside the borders. Yeah,
one of my favorite, this is a tangent, one of my favorite stories about Colonel Tom Parker, and shows just that he would do anything to make a buck, was he used to do the carnival sideshow circuit long before Elvis. And he had dancing chickens. And what he did is he built a little stage, and it was just a hot plate underneath the stage. Right. And he put the chickens on it, and he'd turn the hot plate on, and they'd have to sort of lift their feet, and it looked like they played music, and it looked like they were dancing.
I hate to say it, but I think Elvis was on that hot plate.
Now, it's interesting because we talk about sort of the themes that you developed in John Dies at the End, and we're going to get into this in the next segment. But I'd like to talk a little bit about the themes from some of your other films and how they all kind of coalesce into something that I think is a little deeper and a little different than anything that you've done before. We'll continue the conversation with Don Coscarelli about his film John Dies at the End when we come back. Stay with us. Hey, movie lovers, welcome back to Extra Entertainment Extra. I'm Richard Crouse. I'm really pleased to have in studio with me Don Coscarelli. He is the director of the Phantasm series, Beastmaster, Bubba Ho-Tep, and the movie we're talking about today, John Dies at the End, which is on DVD and Blu-ray right now.
Through Anchor Bay.
Through Anchor Bay. And, we were talking earlier that this movie, I think, fits in a sort of a through line from the films that you've made before, but also veers off a little bit in the sense that it has some deeper philosophical elements that are sort of maybe unfamiliar in some of your other bits of work. Although Phantasm is a lot of ways a coming-of-age story. I think Bubba Ho-Tep is a look at aging and growing old. So it's not like these themes are completely absent in your work, but this is a little different thing. Was it a bit more of a challenge to bring that to the screen?
The only real challenge came in terms of adaptation. I had never adapted a novel of size like that, where it required serious surgery and really trying to winnow it down. So that was a bit difficult. And the other problem, of course, was there were some awesome monologues in the movie what each character would have, and I just made an effort to try to shoot as many of those as I possibly could. But I really came up against the hard fact that when you're making a movie, it is an absolutely different medium than a novel.
Right.
And, where a novel, you can read 50 pages and, the next day another 50, and you're thinking about it and all of that. And a movie, you've got to present it all in 99 minutes. And so, and there's that factor of how long the human butt can sit in the seat, so...
it's the human bladder, isn't it?
Yeah, well, that's also
Hitchcock's
true,
thing,
yes.
Never make a movie longer than the endurance of the human bladder?
Never, exactly, which makes so much sense. But, it was actually a joy to make because we did have independent funding with not much creative interference, which was wonderful. And there, so many edgy things in John Dies at the End that just was... very satisfying for me looking back at it now that it's done.
Well, I think if this had been a studio picture, like it seemed like it might have been at one point, and then we talked about how the rough edges may have been taken off it. I think that it would have been a much different film. I think that the meat monster, for instance, in a studio picture, it would have been a big CGI kind of thing. I love that in this movie it's done practically, which means that the little bits and pieces of this monster that's made out of steaks and ribs and whatever else from a freezer sort of assembles itself in front of you. But there's a real organic kind of homemade feel about that. You know that someone was working on that and not just tapping away at a computer keyboard to create that.
Absolutely true. We did it the old school way. They used a lot of fishing line monofilament and dragging little pieces. We spent 2 days on the floor of that basement dragging these little pieces of meat around. And, one thing I'd learned from my, coming up through the Phantasm films, those were, the effects on those were done through with, paper clips and tape, basically, is how monofilament just doesn't read on camera, and you can get away with a lot of little things like that. Yet, at the same time, I think that the way to go in terms of effects, they're all just tools. But when you can marry digital with the rubber prosthetics, because there's this one moment as the meat monster's finally assembling, we put a digital trout that slithers up the guy's back, and it kind of goes, how'd they do that,
That's awesome. We're talking to Don Coscarelli. He's the director of John Dies at the End, which is available from Anchor Bay right now on DVD and Blu-ray. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about Chase Williamson. He's the star of the film, and he's not a name that you're necessarily going to recognize because you discovered him. Don Coscarelli joins me when we come back on Extra Entertainment. Hey, movie lovers and citizens of Earth, welcome back to Extra Entertainment Extra. I'm Richard Crouse. My guest in studio today is Don Coscarelli. He's the director of John Dies at the End. That was at the Toronto International Film Festival. Made a big splash there. It's now available from Anchor Bay on DVD and Blu-ray. Welcome. Thanks for coming in.
Happy to be here. This is just great, Richard.
Oh, good. Well, listen, I'm a huge fan of Bubba Ho-Tep. We were just talking during the commercial. I love that movie so much that I was very excited that you were able to come in to talk about this film with us. Chase Williamson is your star of the film. He plays David Wong. And I'll tell you, this guy is fantastic in the movie. And I was looking at him thinking, where have I seen this guy before? And then I realized, nowhere.
He's got this almost classic movie star look to him. I was so impressed. For 22 years of age, one of the problems making a movie on a modest budget like we did with John Dies at the End, it was, one of the conventions of it, one of the demands is that we would have to have unknowns in the lead roles.
Right.
And, making ostensibly a horror film, that's the real horror for the movie director because who's going to play that guy and lead us through it? So it was really so fantastic when he walked in a casting session. But the thing is that he had not been in anything. He'd never been in a TV show or a movie. I think he did a project on YouTube, but he just graduated from college drama school. Walked in, I cast him on the spot, and then through circumstances ended up, first day of shooting, he has to do 8 pages of dialogue with Paul Giamatti, one of the greatest actors on the planet. So that, for a director, that's a real horror scene, and just amazing. The kid was just, ice water in his veins. And at the same time, I got to compliment Paul because he's really guided him through it. And, the thing with Giamatti is I find sometimes his acting when he's not saying anything is more interesting than when he's always acting, and I think that really works with the actors. He elevates their performances.
Oh, I think so too. It's funny. Ed Norton went to Yale with him, right?
Really?
And I think Ed was like a year or two behind, and he said Paul Giamatti was the guy that everybody watched. And Norton apparently stood in the wings and watched Paul Giamatti do One Flew at the Cuckoo's Nest like every night that he did it. And he said that was like as good as going to class, was just watching this guy on stage doing the Jack Nicholson role.
Yeah, he's certainly gifted. And amazingly, at this moment, he's appearing as Hamlet back at the Yale Repertory.
Is that right?
Yes,
oh, I didn't know that.
Yes.
That would be amazing.
Yes,
see. Yeah, he's, it's interesting because he can play virtually anything. You look at him in Sideways, and he plays this sort of embittered but still romantic lead of that movie, I guess. You see him in John Adams; it's a different thing. You see him in so many different things. He plays bad guys really well. You see him in Cosmopolis; it's a whole other thing.
Yeah.
This guy is quite something. And in your film, he plays a writer who is trying to sort of figure out if there's a story here in this very kind of elaborate series of events that has happened involving this drug named soy sauce that kind of chooses the people that's going to, I don't know, infect? Is that the right word?
It seems to be a sentient drug that chooses you. That was one of the things that just amazed me about the original story. But yeah, it's certainly with the Giamatti character, he's trying to piece together an unpieceable story. You can't put this thing together. And then there's a wicked twist as to exactly the nature of his character, which we won't give away here, but definitely worth leaving home and buying a copy of the DVD to checking out.
I think so too. And it's interesting. So we're talking about Paul Giamatti trying to understand the story. I've seen the movie twice, and I'm not sure that I understand every little. It's a movie that you benefit from seeing over and over again. And you were saying before we started taping that you're not sure you understand every minute of the movie as well. Is that fair to say?
No, there are still moments in the dialogue from the book, and I would read. There was a moment about the character, the detective, where he said something about trying to find. Or Paul Giamatti trying to find the detective, and I realized that the detective was no longer alive, and that moment is hilarious, really.
Right. Well, there's a lot going on in this movie. It's called John Dies at the End. It's available right now on Anchor Bay, DVD, and Blu-ray. My guest in studio has been Don Coscarelli. So pleased to have you here. And once you see John Dies at the End, then you have to go back, if you haven't already, see Bubba Ho-Tep, check out the Beastmaster, the Phantasm series. How many movies are in the Phantasm series?
There are 4 Phantasms, yes.
So there's
amazingly.
You have an amazing weekend of movie watching there ahead of you if you haven't seen these movies. Don, thanks so much for coming in.
Richard, thanks for having me. It's been terrific.
Join us again next week on Extra Entertainment Extra.